Good morning. My name is Drew Holzoffel. It's great to have everybody here with us today. Just a brief introduction. I wear two hats within this organization. I support the work of the Global CEO Initiative on Alzheimer's Disease. And the second hat is I help advance the Davos Alzheimer's Collaborative. So here we are to start the third day of Lausanne VIII. And we will begin with a panel focused on regulatory issues. The panel is titled The Evolving Regulatory Landscape, Ensuring Excellence and Innovation. Our time together will start with a discussion with global regulatory experts looking at the global regulatory environment. This topic has been a fixture of Lausanne since the start of our series 8 years ago. In fact, we modeled Lausanne after an OECD-hosted workshop in Berlin in 2010 focused on promoting effective and coordinated policies and regulations. It was called Berlin I. So given our interest in Alzheimer's, we thought we needed a Berlin I styled meeting focused on Alzheimer's. So hence, Lausanne I was born. One of our panelists, John Lim, was at Berlin I. So I'd like to get into this conversation quickly, but at first allow the panelists to introduce themselves. And so, Andy, please, your introduction.
Thank you, Drew. I'm Andy von Eschenbach. I'm a urologic oncologist by training and spent my career at MD Anderson Cancer Center in Houston. But then I became the director of the National Cancer Institute and then ultimately served for 4 years as the commissioner of the Food and Drug Administration. And since that time, have seen the critical importance of building upon that cancer experience to be able to address issues such as Alzheimer's, which now are creating such an enormous toll on our public health system and carrying such pain and suffering for patients. It's great to be with you to discuss our pathway forward to be able to accomplish that.
Thank you, Andy. John.
Well, thank you, Drew. Good evening from Singapore. My name is John Lim. I'm a public health physician and health administrator. And for many years, I was Chief Executive Officer of the Health Sciences Authority, which is the regulatory agency in Singapore. And I was CEO for 8 years, but I was with the agency for 14 years. Currently, I'm Executive Director of the Center of Regulatory Excellence, or CORE, at the Duke National University of Singapore Medical School, or Duke NUS, and you can see a picture of the building behind me. And so this center looks at capacity building for regulatory professionals, both from industry and from national regulatory authorities around the Asia Pacific. And we also have think tank functions. I've been involved with Drew and George and others, and I serve on the leadership group of the Davos Alzheimer's Collaborative, the DAC, and I sort of give regulatory perspectives, and I think this is part of the discussion we're having today, which is a very important issue, really, when we're thinking of bringing innovative therapeutics to patients in need. So very happy to join in the conversation today.
Great. Thank you, John. And Hiroshi.
Hey, Drew. And actually, my name is Hiroshi Nakamura, and actually I'm an economist. It's not I'm a doctor or scientist. But I have been involved in the pricing and also the health technology assessment in Japan. That I have also the member of some committees in the Japanese government. For example, a chairperson of a committee on the drug pricing. They're also a vice chairperson of the committee on the cost-effective evaluation. Okay, thank you.
Thank you, and thanks for joining and adding your perspective. And as we talk, as you can hear from the backgrounds, certainly we're going to want to understand what we can learn from oncology to apply to Alzheimer's. We're going to want to understand how we coordinate globally on regulatory issues, and then Hiroshi, of course, your perspective on how the regulatory environment intersects with the payer environment. So I'm excited to have this conversation. We were supposed to have Dr. Carl Broe, who is the head and president of the Federal Institute of Drugs and Medical Devices in Germany. Unfortunately, he cannot join. He had a last-minute briefing with the Minister of Health on the COVID antivirals. So certainly that's a critically important issue. So we're sorry that Dr. Broe cannot join. I wanted to start the conversation by pulling up a clip from the first day of Lausanne. The panel that I'm going to show a clip from was focused on the development of a vaccine for Alzheimer's. And one of the panelists was Dr. Peggy Hamburg. She's the former head of FDA, and I think she frames up a lot of the issues that regulators face and the role of regulators very well. So if we could play that for about 2 minutes and then come back and have the panelists react.
To recognize that the regulatory framework is more than just an operational system. It is really a part of the science of medical product development. The regulators play a key role from the very beginning in helping to understand both the underlying mechanisms of disease and the strategies to address it. The regulators must work with the scientists in industry, academia, or in government, and with patients to really help lay out the R&D process, as well as define the critical regulatory questions that have to be asked and answered. Having a vaccine means having a vaccine where we understand the safety and efficacy of the vaccine. We understand how it can be scaled up and manufactured for broader use, and understand how to define the individuals who should appropriately use this product. We've seen that with COVID, and certainly with Alzheimer's, it's critically important. We recognize that this is a huge unmet public health and medical care need with so many ramifications. It's an urgent issue, and I think that the regulatory can and will really step up to play its critical, unique, and essential role. This is an area where the more regulators can work together around the world, the better off we will be, because there are critical issues of science to be defined, and then there's critical processes to help with the scale-up manufacturing and ultimately distribution and ongoing monitoring.
Great. So you know, regardless of if we're looking at a vaccine or not, I think the what Peggy said holds true across all treatments in front of regulators. Andy, I'd like to start with you and just get your reactions to how Dr. Hamburg laid out the role of regulators.
Well, I think what Peggy brought out very clearly is something that many people may not fully appreciate. Across the number of FDA commissioners, even in different administrations, we've all viewed the regulatory process as having the agency involved in what I described as the total life cycle of the product. So in order to make a regulatory decision, it's not just a matter of reviewing the application once it comes in the door. It's really being engaged in the total development of that product from its very beginning with the preclinical studies, and then going on through the clinical trials and development, but even post-approval and post-marketing to have the ability to do post-market surveillance, so that the agency is engaged throughout that total life cycle and enables it to get significant insights very early on in the preclinical area in terms of things like mechanism of action and the way in which these products may in fact be activating or performing in patients. Then you have the data that emanates from the clinical trial, but even after approval, the agency stays engaged with post-marketing surveillance so that it really allows the agency to be completely informed and make those scientific decisions. Now, in order to do that and do it effectively, obviously the agency has to be interacting with the people who are engaged. In the preclinical area, the researchers who have been part of the development of that product, that can give insights into the biology and the chemistry throughout the manufacturing processes and scale up, and throughout the clinical trials. And then even afterwards with having the data systems in place to do post-market. So what Peggy is indicating is it doesn't matter where commissioner or what administration is in place. The agency continues to make science-based regulatory decisions based on its understanding of the total life cycle of these drugs and medical products.
And John, can I ask, is this, do you agree with this? Is this what you see in Singapore and also your view of regulatory agencies across the globe?
Drew, I absolutely agree. I mean, Peggy and Andy have said it so well and so succinctly. But I think the point also to extrapolate from what Andy has said is it's not just the way in which the US FDA works. Exactly what Andy describes is how all regulatory authorities around the world look at new innovative therapeutics nowadays. And while in the past there was a sort of much clearer divide between what we would call the more developed regulatory authorities in more developed countries, as opposed to those that were more resource constrained. In fact, nowadays, with so much information exchange going on, early engagement really ought to be the order of the day for any innovative therapeutic, whether we're thinking of Alzheimer's, dementia, or in fact, any condition. And in fact, we've seen this very well applied in the course of the COVID-19 pandemic, because early engagement, in fact, was critical to facilitate, although it's still mainly emergency use authorization of vaccines, therapeutics, and even diagnostics, we've seen something at play here which really ought to reflect the way in which regulatory authorities globally take science-based data very early in terms of the development cycle and follow it through. And the advantage of this is that you will have potentially more consistent approvals around the world at the same time, which is in fact what I think we are looking towards these days, rather than a lot of staggered entry into different markets and economies and countries. And this really then means the impact of this is very significant globally for patients around the world, whatever kind of society or circumstance or even demographic situation they're in. So the principles enunciated by Peggy and Andy are absolutely critical. And really, as we think of Alzheimer's, is something that really ought to be encouraged because early engagement with regulatory authorities should be the order of the day. And where there are questions that are being asked, they can actually inform decision-making. In fact, it really needs to go even further upstream, because even in trial design, if those engagements happen early, and most regulatory authorities now do offer that opportunity where the requirements can be discussed very early on, it helps the strategic planning of trials, which in the past perhaps has been an issue, not specifically in the area we're talking about today, but generally, that you could have investigators designing trials for therapeutics, and then they come to regulators with data sets that don't actually answer the questions the regulators are looking for. And that's quite negative and disastrous. So really, that should not be the way in which things move as we go ahead in terms of regulatory engagement between investigators, researchers, companies around the world.
Yeah, and true, as John has pointed out, I mean, this worked exceedingly well during the COVID pandemic. And I'd even like Hiroshi to comment on this, because first of all, there's the one concern that some people raise, that as the regulatory agencies get more engaged with the developers, with the industry and the companies, that somehow or other that contaminates the regulatory decision-making, and that these meetings somehow or other lead to bias. I think it's just the opposite. I mean, there is no one who knows more about the compound that's being evaluated than the people who did the research, who did the science, and who developed it. So a dynamic, appropriate conversation with them that sheds the kind of insights that John has been alluding to, so that the agency not only sees the data and becomes confident in the data, but becomes comfortable with how that product was developed, what its mechanism of action is, what the science is beneath the clinical outcome that we're observing in the trials or in the data. Now, from Hiroshi's standpoint, when the agency does what John alludes to, which is to guide the process in an appropriate way so that the developers meet the regulatory agency's expectations and do it efficiently and effectively without going down blind alleys or making mistakes that they didn't need to or shouldn't have. That leads to a greater cost efficiency. And so from Hiroshi's standpoint, I'd be interested to see why from an economist point of view, we wouldn't want to have success occurring at the very first time that a company presents a product to the agency. When I was there, we did a bit of an analysis as to what happens if you fail on the first time of review. And if you do that, it's at least 1 year before you recycle back, and it costs millions of dollars. So Hiroshi, I think having greater engagement of the regulator with the developer may in fact be a cost-effective measure. Do you agree?
Yeah, exactly. Yes. I think that one of the key the message from her that also the Andy is that the regulator must work not only with the scientists in the industry, the academia, the government, but also with patients. I totally agree with her comment, but I also would like to add one more comment. The collaboration in the information sharing among the regulators and also the payers, and also the medical service providers are also very important. And the collaboration, the information sharing among the regulators and the payers and the medical service provider did not work well under the threat of the COVID in Japan. Regarding the quick access to innovative product in Japan, actually we have 4 different types of regulatory decision. The first one is an approval decision, of course. And the second one, the pricing decision. Then also the healthcare insurance coverage decision. Then finally, the HTA, the health technology assessment decision. To promote the quick access to innovative drugs and the medical devices, also software as the medical devices, SAMD, the regulatory agency should have a close connections and the shared information, the collaboration, the collaborate each other with the payers and the medical service provider and in the early stage. Thank you.
Excellent comments. Thank you all. You know, and a number of things I want to pick up on there. One is just Hiroshi, your last comment about promoting. You know, and Andy and then John, I'd like your comments on this. Yeah, a lot of times I think regulators are seen as gatekeepers, but Andy, I know from talking to you that the FDA sees their mission as to protect and promote public health. And so when you think of promoting public health as a regulator, how do you do that? How does that impact how you view the science in front of you?
Did you want Hiroshi to go first? Or?
I was going to suggest Andy and then John, and then we'll come to Hiroshi.
Well, I think your point's well taken, Drew. I mean, there has been over a period of time some confusion, at least as I have seen it, in terms of what the mission of the agency is. And the law that was initially written was written to protect and to promote and protect the public health. So promotion of public health was the most important reason for the agency to come into existence. So it's not there to necessarily create speed bumps and potholes to slow things down and stop things from moving forward. It's actually there to put a very smooth regulatory pathway in place, but with strong guardrails, so that we make sure that things are done in a science-based way, and that, as John would say, we dot all the I's and cross all the T's. But it's so it works efficiently and effectively to bring life-saving, critically important medical products to desperate patients like those with Alzheimer's. And so I think the mindset of an agency that is there to facilitate and promote and to assure that there is a successful development of a product is the mindset that the agency has.
And John, your thoughts?
Yeah, so I agree with Andy. And I think there are two levels to this, which we're talking about. One, of course, is this promotion versus protection role. And that really is a kind of broad philosophy and approach that needs to be talked about. So I think perhaps if you think of traditional regulation, it's not just in medicines regulation, but anywhere, it's wielding a big stick and basically saying no rather than yes. But this is not really the idea of good regulation. And so even in the center that I run now, we always start off with a little cartoon that has a kind of fulcrum with a lever. And you've got public health, protection of public health, and it must always, in a sense, go more in that direction, but it doesn't go all the way down. There's the other bit of promotion and access, which is the other side of the lever. And so there must be a very fine balance there. But regulators must start with that mindset. Otherwise, it'll be too much of negativity and obstructiveness, which is not going to help, especially when we think that when we realize that good public health means ensuring that you have good, safe, and effective medicines in a timely manner being made available to populations. And when we're thinking of a situation like Alzheimer's, that becomes even more dire. So that's one broad level. But the next level, which really then serves as a kind of protection against these concerns that, Drew, you've mentioned, is to have good processes in place. So it's very clear how, in fact, these engagements come about. And it's not just a very chaotic situation where people are sort of banging on the door every day and trying to access the regulators' offices. There's a clear process for engagement and response and providing data and providing clear guidance. And so it does behoove regulators to have very clear guidances and transparent directions as to how these processes work, but really then to facilitate that ongoing dialogue and discussion. So then when you bring these two together in the system, you can actually achieve what we're talking about, which is early promotion of innovative products, but we're still ensuring safety, quality, and efficacy. And yet we still also protect against concerns about conflict of interest. So I would propose that we look at it in that context, and it's more reassuring to everyone, both in terms of governments as well as the public.
Yeah, Drew, can I pick up on that? Because John's raising another very important point, and that is, so how does the agency do this? I mean, how can it look at the American people, at the world, and say, we are making sure that these products are effective and safe? They do it with data. And if you think about the regulatory agency in a simplistic way, it's a data management business, a data management organization. So data comes in, it's acquired, it's aggregated, it's analyzed, and then the agency acts on it. So what John is raising is that critical important piece of data. So that data starts, as we indicated before, at the very beginning of the total life cycle of the product. And then it continues on, but it continues on in the post-marketing area as well. So as long as the agencies, the regulators have the infrastructure, have the wherewithal to continually be able to acquire, aggregate, and analyze data about a particular product, then they're able to make the most informed decisions, and if necessary, even change that decision and alter it and modify it. And that gives the public, the people around the world, the kind of assurances that their agency is on guard, is making certain that is both promoting and protecting their health, because it's using data to constantly make those science-based decisions.
And maybe a quick point, Andy, to add on to what you just said. Just a quick point would be that the data also is looked through the lens of a benefit-risk framework. So regulators are always balancing benefit versus risk. And when these templates and approaches are clear, that again serves to assure the public that it's very objective, it's very science-based, and the data is being handled in an appropriate way. So I think that's another component to this that we need to bear in mind.
And I think the data, Hiroshi can comment on the data that he looks at and analyzes. This is all still part of the same process. And his perspective is critically important in this regard as well.
Hiroshi, over to you, please.
Yes. So I have been involved in the pricing, also the insurance, the national the healthcare insurance coverage, also the HTA. So I try to make some comments on based on this view, and I think that I try to give you some key words. That is a predictability. There also is the accountability. The special point is very important is a predictability to the pharmaceutical company. Otherwise, pharmaceutical company will be discouraged to make more investment to develop the innovative drugs faster. Also the public, the accountability is also very important because the regulator have to convince the people how the useful, how cost effectiveness, the medicines are. So that kind of information must be provided to the public. So that is the accountability. That is a key issue. So that's why I think my concern is the regulators. I think any in the countries have very is not wide open. The information is very closed. Also, is just only shared a limited the stakeholder. But that is not so good idea. So I think the accountability to the public, or also the predictability, that is a very, very important issue to us.
I'd like to switch gears a little bit here to somewhat of some breaking news. If you live on the East Coast, 7:30 a.m. this morning, there was an announcement that CHMP had put out a negative trend vote on the aducanumab marketing authorization application. And while a formal opinion is not expected to be made until their December meeting, which is the 13th to 16th, this is certainly a possible indication of where we will end up in mid-December. And so I wanted to start with Andy and John with reactions to this developing news.
Well, I think it's important to put things into context as one goes about judging these regulatory decisions. Clearly, as we've been discussing all along, it's a matter of putting the public health needs first and foremost. So very many regulatory decisions are based on what that need is. It's, as John had pointed out, it's the risk-benefit ratio. And so even with regard to COVID, it was emergency use authorizations because of the critical public health need that needed to be addressed. So we had that pandemic, but we have to recognize that Alzheimer's is also a pandemic. And the need here is as great, if not greater, than the need that occurred, if, for example, in oncology many years ago. So we put that context first and then recognize that, as the experience in oncology taught us, oftentimes first in class is not necessarily best in class. We know that a lot of these drugs are incremental. So cancer therapies were critically necessary because the alternative was death. And yet their response rates were maybe in the 30 to 40% range, but they were the first to come forward. And then we built upon that foundation with continued incremental success because we had these drugs available to be able to be used. So my first point is put it into the context of the nature of the problem. Recognize that the first approval may not be the total solution to the problem, nor should it be necessarily, but it is the critically first important step for then an incremental effort to continue to improve. And the way you do that is by gathering the data of that experience, particularly in a real world setting. And that enables the process to continue to evolve and go forward. So I guess I'm coming around in a long way of saying, I would hope that the approvals would occur, but occur in a way that we are carefully monitoring and understanding what their impact is on the populations being treated. The preclinical studies clearly show that there's biological effect, and building on that biological effect to maximize clinical effect is a challenge both for the regulator as well as the developer, and it's all done in the interest of improving the lives of patients. So I would hope that it'd be a much more favorable response than a negative one.
John, your thoughts?
Yeah, so just to build on that, so I think what I'm hearing Andy saying, and I agree with that, is that really it's the data, what is it showing? And I think when you have advisory committees assessing this, they will have to make that assessment in terms of whether the data proving efficacy and safety versus the actual threshold of risk is critical in determining whether they're going to grant an advice to approve or not to do so. And then the agency must make that decision accordingly. And I think because of Andy's point, which I totally agree with, when you're thinking of conditions of need, where in fact there is nothing very much available to treat those conditions, then in fact risk thresholds, certainly amongst the patients themselves, are quite different from the general population where they may be subject to other sorts of risk thresholds. And perhaps these elements are not always totally assessed to an adequate degree. As for this particular decision or the way it's trending, I mean, I can't comment too much because I think we also need to really hear and see the full report. And in fact, in most other parts of the world, because no submissions have been made for ADUHELM, I don't think the data sets are fully there for others to make an analysis of. So we can only talk of broad principles and take a reference from decisions that the FDA and now potentially the European Medicines Agency will make and take it from there. But I think what we're also saying is that we do need to look at need and whether in fact patient populations are willing to take whatever risks are available. But I think what I would also like to hear from Hiroshi is, especially in the case of ADUHELM, even though the approval is there in the US, there is great concern in terms of the cost of the product. So I think this is a major issue also. And although it should not affect the primary regulatory decision of a medicines regulatory authority, from a broader health systems perspective, there is an implication whether it is affordable, even when patients are willing to take the risk. So I don't know, maybe I could ask Hiroshi to comment on this, because I think it's a very important part of the whole picture of these new products coming onto the market.
Yes. So I think that, it's a very important issue is the right patient and the right drug and the right time and the right dose and right route are very, very important, especially for the very super expensive drug with potentially many patients to make our healthcare system sustainable. So I think, in this sense, your narrower targeting is also very important to design a clinical trial and post-marketing surveillance. So I think that is a very important issue.
Yeah, I think, Drew, we need to emphasize that over and over again. Just because a drug is approved does not mean that the regulatory agency no longer should be engaged or becomes blind to whatever happens after that. The opportunity for post-market surveillance, for the continuing gathering of data, should be an integral part of these processes. Now, where I think is also important to point out for viewers is there are different agencies involved. In the United States, the FDA makes regulatory decisions based on the science of efficacy and safety. Someone else should make decisions with regard to pricing and the value proposition. Those should be completely separate. That's not to say they can't look at the same data to be coming up with their own individual decisions, but I don't believe the FDA should be making regulatory decisions based on price of a drug. It should be based only on the science of whether that drug does what it says it does without doing unnecessary harm.
So we've talked a lot about...
Sorry, I was just going to comment that, I was just going to comment, building on Andy's point, that in fact, very few medicines regulatory authorities take pricing into effect. There is an attempt, I think, perhaps in some jurisdictions to try and merge this together, but really most agencies would follow the FDA approach and look at safety, quality, efficacy, and leave pricing as a next step decision.
So we've talked about the partnership between developers and regulators and even payers, and it's not a moment in time. There's not a decision that's written in stone. One of the things I wanted to get your opinions on was frankly what happened on June 7th in the U.S. There was accelerated approval for Aduhelm. Are there similar mechanisms for accelerated approval outside of the U.S.? And why is this important? Do you think this is an important pathway? And if so, why? So I'll just leave that open to whoever wants to respond first.
Well, I think the quick answer is yes, there are, Drew. There are, and we've seen this in COVID, right? I mean, there are accelerated pathways, but there are also expedited and rolling submission approaches. And in fact, that does pick up a point that Andy said, that in fact, decisions can be made earlier sometimes without the traditional full data set, as long as there is a proper surveillance mechanism for adverse event monitoring after the fact. And in fact, we're seeing this play out now in terms of the COVID products, because emergency use authorization of products has come in. They haven't really, in most jurisdictions outside the US, they've not gone to full marketing authorization. But nonetheless, they're being used, the vaccines are being used in a way that, in a sense, would have been expected of a fully authorized product in the past. And so I think this kind of model is working quite significantly in many jurisdictions now. And picking up another point that Andy made reference to is that increasingly the use of real world evidence is becoming part of this process as well, so that decisions can potentially be made earlier, but based on non-traditional approaches, not using the normal clinical trial approach. And it's not that we will see the end of the use of traditional clinical trials in the various phases, but in certain cases, again, where risk thresholds and need is there, real world evidence is potentially coming to play. But what regulators are now grappling with is determining those specific endpoints and determining how to use real world evidence to ensure that the assessments of safety, efficacy are in fact up to the requirements to ensure safety of the patient populations. So I think it's a very dynamic environment that you have brought up, and we're seeing it play out now. And in fact, many of the things we're seeing in terms of what I could call regulatory agility or regulatory flexibility in the course of the pandemic are things many people are saying should become codified and form part of the way forward to approach innovative products in the future.
Yeah, I think, Drew,
so you mentioned,
John's making a really important point, that COVID really shone a light on a process that's been underway, but maybe not fully understood and appreciated. The fact of the matter is that over time, science has evolved. The ability to gather information and data to understand these products in ways we just never could before. I mean, look at the fact that we go from the recognition of a virus to its genetic sequencing in record time, and then use that science and that data to then be able to fashion vaccines. So if the science has been evolving, and at the same time, the information technologies by which we can gather data and analyze data is evolving and improving. And if methodologies are improving, where we're going from new biostatistical methodologies like Bayesian statistics, etc. So if all of that is evolving, then the regulatory process has to evolve as well. And so when we see some of these new regulatory pathways being put in place, they're not capricious. They are being built upon the progress that's occurring in all these other areas, because they're a part of the toolkit that the agency now has available to it to make those science-based regulatory decisions, and to do it in a much more rapid, much more efficient. So you can call it fast track, or you can call it breakthrough, or you can put different names on it. But it's not capricious. It's being based on progress that's occurred, that's enabled those kinds of opportunities to emerge, and the agencies are embracing it, and the public should welcome it.
Hiroshi, I want to just give you an opportunity from your perspective. What is the impact of these accelerated approval mechanisms?
We have a very similar the system, accelerated approval system, and introduced in Japan. But I think the basic, the requirement is the safety must be guaranteed. The safety must be guaranteed. Then we have to correct the real world data in terms of the effectiveness. We have the higher evaluation of the effectiveness. Then with it's like a formal approval turn out to be a formal approval.
And the other thing Hiroshi said previously, which I think is really important, is he was outlining the right patient, the right time, the right administration, the right dose. Our ability to now look at populations and define them much more precisely so that we can, if you will, target clinical trials in a much more efficient and much more effective way. He's making the point that we can be much more rational now about these decisions and not ration them.
Yes.
Yeah, and the last 2 days, the development of biomarkers and the need for even more biomarkers has been emphasized, and fits with your point. We're coming close to our end of time here. So what I wanted to do is put out one more question, but also as you answer the question, I'd like your thoughts, just any final thoughts that you might have for this group. But one result of the approval of Aduhelm in the U.S. Was that it seems like more products are going to come in front of the regulatory agencies faster than before. I would love to hear what you think about the environment these drugs will face as they go in front of regulators, and then Hiroshi as they go in front of payers. So that's the question to close on, and then any other thoughts. Let's start with Hiroshi. We'll go John and then Andy. Hiroshi, please.
Yeah, it's kind of a very difficult question, but I think the new trend is like a speed and the quickness, because the patients are waiting, But I think from the perspective of the payers, or the insurance, the insurance, the coverage, but I have to say that is the information sharing is very, very important from the earliest stage of approval process, because that kind of information is provided to the payers and also the decision makers about the insurance coverage. That kind of the early information will help them to make a quick decision to make sure that there is the quicker the access to the innovative drugs.
Thank you. John?
Well, I think my perspective is that although Aduhelm may be facing issues in terms of both approvals, whether we're thinking of the FDA approval, which is a positive one, and we're not quite sure what will happen in Europe, and whether this will then have negative implications in terms of decisions elsewhere, I think there are many lessons to learn from that. But I would take a more optimistic view that because it has, in fact, drawn the attention of society and regulators to the urgent need to bring new therapies, and as Hiroshi was saying, to the patients who are in need. In fact, I think there may be a silver lining, as it were, that in fact it will open up regulators to be willing to engage more, but it then does require the developers to actually pick up what we've been talking about in this session, to engage early. And then I think there is, in fact, a lot of positivity that will result to really address this very critical need of Alzheimer's and neurocognitive disorders. So I think, in fact, although people are concerned about the impact, the potential for positive follow-through is, in fact, quite significant.
Yeah,
Thank you, John.
I think, Drew, this is the beginning of the end, in the sense that, first of all, we all recognize that we've had this pandemic of COVID, but neurodegenerative diseases, Alzheimer's, is a pandemic as well and needs critically to be addressed. The second point I would make is that the science in neurobiology is exploding, and we're able to now understand the brain and neurodegenerative and neurocognitive disorders in a much more profound way than we ever could before. We now have a window on the brain with kind of the advances that have been made in imaging. So the tools that are now available to us with which to develop these products is becoming increasingly more sophisticated. So we're going to see those opportunities continue to evolve and present themselves. And Alzheimer's is just, in my opinion, the beginning of that process, not the end of it, more to come. And so I think the regulator has to be open to this journey, if you will, work hand in hand, as John has indicated, gather the kind of data that will satisfy people like Hiroshi and others who have to make decisions about clinical utility and value and price. But I think we have to come together and say, this is our challenge for the future. We have to address it almost the same way we've addressed COVID, because the need is so great and there's nothing else available for these desperate patients. And so this is the first step in what will be an important journey.
Well, thank you all. We've reached the end of our time. It was absolutely excellent. The points you raised, your optimism and your deep insights. So we thank you. And we also thank you for your leadership as we move forward in what's been termed the golden age of neuroscience. So look forward to continued conversations. Now, for everybody who's watching, we will turn to a 10-minute break. So if everybody can take a break and come back in 10 minutes, which is a little less than 10 minutes, 8:55 East Coast. Thank you all.